Welcome to Wildlife for Sleep. This channel is a quiet place where nature, wildlife, and ancient worlds come together to help you relax, unwind, and drift into deep rest. If you enjoy calm documentaries like this and find them helpful for sleep or relaxation, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps this channel grow and allows me to create more peaceful content for you. Now get comfortable and let the journey begin. Long before the first terror bird ever stood upright on open ground, before massive beaks cast shadows across prehistoric plains, before speed and silence became weapons shaped by evolution, the Earth itself was already changing in slow, unhurried ways. Continents were drifting apart. Oceans were reorganizing their currents. Climates were cooling in some regions while warming in others. And life was responding, not with intention, but with quiet persistence. The story of terror birds does not begin with fear or dominance. It begins with absence, with the disappearance of something else. When the age of the non-avian dinosaurs ended roughly 66 million years ago, ecosystems across the planet were emptied of their largest terrestrial predators. Niches that had once been occupied by towering reptiles were suddenly open. And evolution, patient and indifferent, began experimenting again. Birds which had survived the mass extinction in smaller, more flexible forms, found themselves in a world where size was no longer forbidden in the early Paleogene period. Especially during the Paleocene and Eocene epochs, birds diversified rapidly. Wings adapted for soaring, perching, swimming, and running. Beaks reshaped themselves for seeds, fish, insects, and flesh. In isolation, especially on southern continents like South America, where placental mammalian predators were absent or limited, birds began to explore a path that would eventually lead toward dominance on land. This exploration was not sudden. It unfolded across millions of years, through gradual increases in body mass, elongation of legs, reduction of flight capability, and reinforcement of skeletal structures for running rather than flying. Early ancestors of terror birds were not yet giants. They were ground-dwelling birds that still retained some ability to fly, though increasingly reluctant to do so. Their wings shortened slowly, generation by generation, becoming less useful for lift and more useful for balance. Muscles rearranged, bones thickened. The sternum, once critical for flight muscles, reduced in prominence. Legs lengthened and strengthened, joints aligning to absorb impact from running rather than landing. At the same time, the beak began to change, not merely growing larger, but becoming deeper, heavier, and more hooked at the tip. This was not ornamentation, it was engineering. The beak would eventually function as a killing tool, capable of delivering powerful downward strikes. But in these early stages, it was simply adapting to a more carnivorous diet. Small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and other birds became targets. Protein-supported growth reinforced dominance. South America, isolated as an island continent for much of the Cenozoic era, provided the perfect environment for this experiment. Without large mammalian carnivores to compete with them, Birds filled the apex predator roles. Forests, open woodlands, floodplains, and grasslands expanded and contracted with shifting climates. And through it all, these proto-terror birds followed prey on foot, running rather than flying, observing rather than chasing blindly. Speed became more valuable than endurance. Vision sharpened. Neck muscles strengthened to stabilize the skull during rapid movement. Balance systems within the inner ear adjusted to upright posture and fast directional changes. Over time, these birds crossed a threshold. Flight was no longer advantageous. The energy cost of lifting an increasingly massive body outweighed the benefit. Wings became vestigial, no longer tools of escape, but silent witnesses to ancestry. From this point forward, survival depended entirely on the ground, on legs built for speed, on beaks built for force, on height that allowed scanning above vegetation. These were not monsters. They were outcomes, shaped by geography, isolation, and opportunity. By the early to middle Cenozoic, distinct lineages of large, flightless predatory birds were emerging, what we now collectively call terror birds, or scientifically, Phorusrhacidae. At this stage, they were still diversifying, still testing limits of size, speed, and strategy. Some lineages favored massive bulk and crushing power. Others favored lighter frames and pursuit. None yet represented the full expression of terror that would later define the group. But the foundation was complete. The world had made room, and evolution had begun to fill it slowly, quietly, without awareness. A new kind of land predator was taking shape. One that would rule entire ecosystems not with claws or teeth, but with height, speed, and a beak designed for finality. In the next part, this experiment will continue, following terror birds as they diversify into distinct forms, spread across ancient landscapes, and refine the traits that would make them the dominant terrestrial hunters of their time. As the Cenozoic world continued to unfold, the early descendants of these ground-dwelling predatory birds began to diverge more clearly, shaped by landscapes that were themselves in motion. South America remained isolated, separated from North America by wide seas, functioning as a vast natural laboratory where evolution could proceed without interruption. Climates during the Eocene and early Oligocene were generally warmer and more humid than today, supporting forests, wetlands, and open woodlands that shifted gradually over time. Within these environments, terror birds began to specialize. Some grew taller, their legs lengthening to cover ground efficiently across open spaces. Others became heavier, favoring power over speed, dominating dense forests where ambush mattered more than pursuit. This diversification did not happen quickly. It was measured in thousands of generations, each slightly different from the last, each tested quietly by hunger, competition, and chance. Skeletal remains from this period show increasing robustness in the skull, especially around the beak and neck. Vertebrae fused and thickened, allowing the head to deliver forceful strikes without injury. The beak, now unmistakably raptorial, curved sharply downward, its tip capable of puncturing bone or severing spinal cords. Unlike mammalian predators that relied on teeth to grip and tear, terror birds relied on precision and momentum. A downward strike, driven by powerful neck muscles, could incapacitate prey instantly. This method required balance, timing, and accuracy. Rather than prolonged struggle, vision became a dominant sense. Eye sockets enlarged and shifted forward, increasing depth perception. The brain regions associated with visual processing expanded, while those associated with flight coordination diminished. These birds were not simply large, they were focused. Their entire bodies became instruments designed for a narrow purpose. Hunting on land, fossil trackways suggest that many terror birds walked and ran with long, confident strides. Feet bore 3 strong forward-facing toes ending in blunt claws, not primarily for grasping prey, but for stability and traction during high-speed movement. The tail, reduced and stiffened, acted as a counterbalance during running, preventing tipping during rapid turns. Wings, now too small for flight, assisted subtly with balance, opening slightly during sudden stops or directional changes. In these ancient ecosystems, terror birds did not exist alone. They shared their environments with early mammals, reptiles, and other birds. Mammals were present, but mostly small to medium-sized, often herbivorous or omnivorous. Carnivorous mammals existed, but none matched the size or dominance of the larger terror birds during this time. As a result, terror birds occupied the highest trophic levels. They were apex predators, shaping prey populations through presence as much as through killing. Smaller animals adapted by becoming faster, more alert, or more secretive. Burrowing increased. Nocturnal behavior expanded. Life adjusted itself quietly around these towering birds. Reproduction during this phase also adapted to terrestrial dominance. Terror birds likely nested on the ground, choosing open areas with good visibility. Eggs were large, requiring significant investment of energy. Clutch sizes were likely small, favoring quality over quantity. Parental care, inferred from bone growth patterns and nesting evidence in related birds, was likely extended, with chicks remaining vulnerable for long periods before reaching independence. Juveniles would not have been born as miniature hunters. They would have grown gradually, learning movement, balance, and hunting behavior through observation and practice. Mortality among the young was likely high, reinforcing the evolutionary pressure toward fewer offspring and longer lifespans. As millions of years passed, the terror birds refined their place within these ecosystems. Their presence became a constant, not aggressive, not chaotic, but firm. They did not need to chase endlessly. Their size and reputation alone may have displaced competitors. Other predators adjusted their activity patterns to avoid them. Scavenging opportunities increased after terror bird kills, feeding entire communities of smaller animals. In this way, terror birds function not only as hunters, but as ecosystem regulators, shaping energy flow and population structure across vast regions. By the late Oligocene and into the Miocene, these birds had reached a critical point in their evolution. They were no longer experimental forms. They were established, dominant, and diverse, ready to expand further, both in size and ecological influence. In the next part, the story will follow terror birds into their period of greatest dominance, exploring their largest species, their hunting strategies in detail, and the landscapes they ruled for millions of years. By the time the Miocene epoch settled into its long, stable rhythms, terror birds had reached the height of their evolutionary confidence. The landscapes they inhabited were broad and varied, ranging from open grasslands to patchy forests and river-fed plains. Climates fluctuated slowly, but predictably, allowing long-established predator-prey relationships to deepen rather than reset. Within these conditions, the largest and most specialized terror birds emerged, some towering well over 2 meters in height, their skulls alone longer than a human arm. These giants did not evolve toward speed alone, nor toward brute mass alone, but toward a careful balance between the two. Legs were columnar and powerful, capable of sudden acceleration, but also of sustained walking across long distances. This was not the build of an ambush predator that waited motionless for hours, nor of a pursuit predator that exhausted itself in long chases. It was the build of an animal that controlled space, that could approach deliberately, strike decisively, and move on without waste. The skull became the defining feature of these birds. Thickened bone surrounded the braincase, protecting it from the shock of repeated impacts. The beak grew deeper and more laterally compressed, forming a natural blade. Biomechanical studies of fossil skulls suggest that while the beak was not optimized for lateral shaking, it excelled at delivering powerful vertical blows. The head would be raised, the neck muscles tensed, and then the beak driven downward with remarkable force. Smaller prey may have been killed instantly. Larger prey may have been struck repeatedly, targeting the head, neck, or spine until collapse occurred. This method minimized risk. There was little grappling, little prolonged struggle. Terror birds did not rely on teeth to hold prey that could fight back. They relied on gravity, leverage, and precision. Their necks, though appearing slender, were reinforced internally with strong muscle attachments and dense vertebrae, allowing controlled motion even under heavy loads. The eyes of these birds were positioned high and forward, granting a wide field of view across open terrain. From a distance, a terror bird could scan for movement while remaining relatively still. Prey animals, often smaller mammals or reptiles, would have been aware of the bird's presence long before it moved. But awareness did not equal escape. Many prey species relied on camouflage or freezing behavior, strategies that were effective against mammalian predators, but less so against a tall, visually oriented hunter. Once a terror bird began to move, its height allowed it to see above grasses and low vegetation, maintaining visual contact even as prey attempted to flee. Speed bursts, rather than sustained pursuit, were likely used. A few seconds of rapid acceleration followed by a strike, then stillness again. Within these ecosystems, terror birds faced little competition from animals of similar size, crocodilians dominated waterways, while mammals remained mostly smaller and specialized in niches terror birds did not exploit. As a result, these birds often fed at the top of the food web, influencing not just prey populations but also scavenger behavior. Carcasses left behind supported insects, small mammals, reptiles, and other birds. Energy flowed outward from each kill, making terror birds central nodes in the ecological network. Social behavior among terror birds remains uncertain, but evidence suggests they were largely solitary or loosely territorial. Their size reduced the need for cooperation, and their feeding strategy did not benefit from pack behavior. Individuals likely maintained ranges that overlapped minimally, communicating dominance through posture, display, or vocalization rather than frequent conflict. Fighting between adults would have been costly, risking injury to legs or necks that were essential for survival. Avoidance and spacing were safer strategies, reinforced by visual recognition and learned boundaries. Reproduction during this peak period followed patterns seen in large modern birds. Breeding seasons likely coincided with periods of prey abundance. Nests would have been simple ground scrapes or shallow depressions, placed where visibility was high and approach could be detected early. Eggs were large and few. Incubation periods were long. Growth rates in juveniles were steady rather than rapid, indicating long developmental phases. Young birds would have spent extended time under parental tolerance, learning movement and prey recognition gradually. Many would not survive to adulthood, but those that did carried the refined traits forward. For millions of years, this system persisted. Terror birds hunted, prey adapted. Landscapes shifted slowly but remained recognizable. Extinction was not yet a pressure. Decline was not yet written. The birds did not know they were at their peak. They simply existed within it. In the next part, the story will move closer to the daily life of an individual terror bird, slowing down to follow a single day across ancient ground, examining behavior, movement, feeding, and rest in detail, revealing how dominance expressed itself not in constant action, but in controlled stillness. Morning on the Miocene plains did not begin with urgency for a terror bird. Light arrived gradually, softening the contrast between ground and sky, revealing shapes long before warmth followed. The bird stood upright, motionless, its body already balanced. Muscles warmed through subtle shifts of weight rather than overt movement. There was no need to rush. Hunger existed, but it was measured, familiar, and managed from its height. The terror bird surveyed the land in silence, eyes scanning for small movements that disrupted the stillness. A rustle in grass, a brief flicker of motion near the edge of a watercourse. The presence of life was everywhere, but not all of it required action. The bird's metabolism favored patience. Energy was conserved whenever possible. When movement came, it was deliberate. A slow walk began, long legs lifting and setting down with minimal sound, toes spreading slightly on contact to distribute weight and maintain balance. Wings hung close to the body, not used for flight, but occasionally opening a fraction to steady turns or sudden stops. The head remained elevated, neck curved slightly, keeping the beak aligned downward, ready. As the terror bird moved, smaller animals adjusted instinctively. Some froze, some retreated into cover, some fled outright. The bird did not chase indiscriminately. It selected prey. Size mattered, terrain mattered, effort was weighed against reward. When the decision was made, it happened quickly, a sudden acceleration. Legs driving forward in powerful strides, the distance closed in seconds, the neck flexed, then straightened with force, driving the beak downward. The strike was brief, precise, final. Once the prey collapsed, the bird paused again, standing over the body, scanning the surroundings for movement. There was no need to hurry feeding, competition was minimal. Scavengers would not approach until the bird moved away. The terror bird used its beak to tear flesh in controlled motions, lifting and swallowing manageable portions rather than consuming indiscriminately. Feeding was efficient, not frantic. Once satiated, the bird did not linger unnecessarily. It moved away from the remains, leaving what it did not need, allowing the ecosystem to absorb the excess. Midday brought little change. Temperatures rose slightly, but activity remained low. The terror bird sought open ground where visibility remained high, resting while standing, occasionally lowering its body slightly but rarely lying down fully. Sleep, if it occurred, was shallow and brief. Awareness never fully disengaged. The land was quiet, but not safe enough for complete surrender. The afternoon passed slowly, occasional movement, occasional feeding, long stretches of stillness. The bird's presence shaped the space around it, creating zones of avoidance without requiring constant assertion. As evening approached, light softened again, shadows lengthened. The terror bird repositioned itself toward familiar ground, not out of comfort, but strategy. Terrain it knew reduced risk. Night did not signal danger so much as limitation. Vision remained strong, but hunting efficiency declined. Activity slowed further. The bird remained upright, resting in place, conserving energy until light returned. This was not boredom, not waiting, it was equilibrium. A life structured not around constant action, but around restraint. Day after day, year after year. This pattern repeated dominance, expressed not through noise or aggression, but through quiet occupation of space. In the next part, the focus will shift toward the early life of a terror bird, following the journey from egg to juvenile, examining growth, vulnerability, learning, and the long path toward becoming a fully formed apex predator. Long before a terror bird ever stood at full height or delivered its first decisive strike, its life began in stillness, within an egg laid directly on the ground, exposed to wind, temperature shifts, and the quiet risks of an open world. The nest was simple, often nothing more than a shallow depression scraped into soil or sand, chosen carefully for visibility rather than concealment. Elevation mattered, line of sight mattered. The adult terror bird relied on early detection rather than camouflage. Incubation was a slow commitment. The adult remained nearby, standing rather than sitting for long periods, regulating temperature through body positioning and timing rather than constant contact. Eggs were large, heavy, and few. Each one represented significant investment. There was no excess, no abundance. Survival favored patience and selectivity even at the beginning of life. When hatching finally occurred, it did not happen all at once. The shell weakened gradually. Small fractures appeared, movement inside increased slowly, and eventually the chick emerged, damp, unsteady, and immediately vulnerable. It did not resemble the towering predator it would become. Its proportions were uneven, legs long but weak, neck thin and unstable, the beak present but small. Lacking strength or weight, downy feathers covered the body, providing limited insulation but little protection in these earliest moments. Survival depended almost entirely on proximity to the adult. The chick could not run effectively, could not strike, could not defend itself. It learned first to stand, then to follow. Movements were awkward and exhausting. Balance was not instinctive, it was practiced. Repeated again and again through small corrections and falls. The adult terror bird did not feed the chick in the way many modern birds do. Instead, it tolerated proximity to kills, allowing the juvenile to tear small portions, learning how to use the beak through imitation rather than instruction. This learning was slow. Muscle strength developed gradually. Coordination followed. The chick observed posture, timing, and stillness long before it attempted anything resembling a hunt. Mortality during this phase was high. Many chicks did not survive their first weeks. Exposure, predation, accidents all removed individuals before growth could protect them. This was not wasteful. It was selective. Those that survived carried traits suited for the demands ahead. As weeks turned into months, growth continued steadily. Bones lengthened, muscles thickened. The neck strengthened enough to support longer periods of upright posture. The beak hardened, its internal structure reinforcing to withstand increasing force. Down feathers were replaced gradually by stronger plumage. Wings remained small, but functional enough for balance and short bursts of flapping during rapid movement. Juvenile terror birds did not hunt independently early on. They followed, watched, tested small movements, chased insects or very small animals. Failures were frequent, but risk was low. Learning was incremental. The adult maintained distance without abandoning, presence without interference. As size increased, vulnerability decreased. Predators that could threaten a chick became less effective as the juvenile approached adult height. By this stage, the young terror bird began to occupy space more confidently. Posture changed. The head was held higher, steps became more measured, pauses grew longer. These were not conscious changes. They emerged naturally as strength caught up to structure. Adolescence extended over a long period, years rather than months. During this time, the bird was neither helpless nor dominant. It existed between states, capable of survival, but still refining the skills required for independence. Eventually, separation occurred, not abruptly, not aggressively. The young terror bird simply began to range farther, returning less often, relying more on its own judgments. At full maturity, it would occupy its own territory. But the foundation of that life had been laid slowly, through observation, patience, and endurance rather than instinct alone. In the next part, The story will follow terror birds through full adulthood across decades, exploring longevity, territorial behavior, competition, and how these birds maintained dominance over immense spans of time without constant conflict. Adulthood for a terror bird did not announce itself with a sudden change. It arrived gradually, settling into the body as growth slowed and strength stabilized. The long bones reached their final length, muscle mass thickened, and then stopped increasing, coordination refined, until movement required little conscious adjustment. By this stage, the bird's height alone reshaped its relationship with the landscape, standing upright. It could see over vegetation, across shallow valleys, and along river margins without moving. This vantage reduced uncertainty, allowing decisions to be made before effort was spent. Territory became central to adult life, not in the sense of constant defense, but in familiarity. A terror bird learned the contours of its range through repetition, where prey was most likely to appear, where footing was stable, where water gathered seasonally, where visibility was compromised and caution was required. These details were not mapped intentionally. They were absorbed through daily movement. Most adult terror birds likely lived alone, maintaining spacing through avoidance rather than confrontation. Encounters between adults were rare and usually resolved through posture and display. Rather than physical conflict, height mattered, stance mattered. The way the head was held, the angle of the beak, the stillness or tension of the neck all communicated intent. Escalation was costly and unnecessary. Injury to a leg or neck could end a life that depended entirely on mobility and precision. When conflict did occur, it was brief, forceful, and decisive. But such moments were exceptions. The greater pattern was stability. Feeding during adulthood followed the same restrained efficiency developed earlier. The terror bird did not need to eat daily. It needed to eat effectively. Large meals spaced across time reduced exposure and conserved energy. Digestion was slow and thorough. Rest followed feeding, often standing in open ground where threats could be seen long before they approached. Aging began subtly, not through weakness, but through where joints stiffened slightly after long periods of stillness. Beak edges dulled incrementally from repeated impact. Reaction time slowed by fractions rather than degrees. None of this removed dominance. It altered pacing. The bird moved a little less, waited a little longer, relied more on position than pursuit. Experience compensated for physical decline. Older terror birds likely hunted less frequently, but with greater selectivity, choosing situations where success was nearly assured, prey that moved predictably, terrain that favored control. The world during this phase remained largely stable. Climates shifted gradually. Prey communities adjusted, but the fundamental structure of ecosystems held. Terror birds continued their roles without disruption. Births balanced deaths. Territories remained occupied for millions of years. This balance persisted. The birds did not sense time passing. They lived within repetition. Movement, rest, feeding, stillness, again and again, until pressures began to accumulate from outside their control, shifts that would not affect individuals immediately, but would slowly alter the conditions that supported the entire lineage. In the next part, the story will widen again, examining environmental change, shifting climates, and the first signs that the world terror birds had mastered was beginning to transform in ways that patience alone could not address. The first changes that touched the world of the terror birds did not arrive as threats. They arrived as adjustments. Climates cooled and warmed in slow oscillations, altering rainfall patterns, reshaping vegetation, and gradually transforming the open landscapes that had long favored large ground-running predators. Forests expanded in some regions, breaking up continuous plains into mosaics of trees, scrub, and open ground. Grasslands shifted their boundaries. Wetlands appeared where dry ground once held. None of this happened quickly enough to demand immediate adaptation from individual birds. They continued to hunt, to rest, to occupy familiar territories, unaware that the foundations beneath their dominance were slowly rearranging. Prey species responded first. Some mammals grew larger and faster, exploiting new plant growth and more complex terrain. Others became more social, more vigilant, or more nocturnal. Diversity increased, but predictability declined for terror birds. This meant that hunting required slightly more effort, lines of sight shortened. Prey escaped into cover more easily, success rates remained high. But margins narrowed at the same time. A new presence began to press gently at the edges of their world. Mammals that had once been small and marginal began to diversify into more specialized carnivorous forms. These mammals were not yet dominant, not yet competitors in the open plains, but they filled spaces terror birds did not occupy: forests, undergrowth, twilight hours. Their teeth and jaws evolved toward slicing and gripping rather than striking. Their hunting strategies favored endurance, cooperation, and pursuit in confined spaces. At first, coexistence was stable. Terror birds and mammalian predators avoided one another through preference rather than conflict. Each remained effective within its own domain. But the boundaries between domains continued to blur as environments became more complex. Over long spans of time, this complexity favored adaptability over specialization. Terror birds were highly effective within open terrain, but less flexible when those spaces fragmented. Their height and speed remained advantages, but only where they could be used. Elsewhere, caution replaced dominance. Reproduction began to feel the strain, not dramatically, but subtly. Nesting sites became harder to secure with clear visibility. Juveniles faced higher risks in denser landscapes where detection of threats was delayed. Small increases in juvenile mortality accumulated across generations. Populations did not collapse, they thinned. Distribution became patchier. Terror birds persisted, but not everywhere they once had. Their ranges contracted toward regions that still favored open ground. This contraction did not weaken individuals. It reduced options. Resilience narrowed. Competition with mammals increased gradually, not through direct confrontation, but through shared pressure on prey populations. Mammals reproduced faster, adapted quicker. filled vacated niches with speed that birds could not match. Terror birds continued to rely on patience and precision, strategies that had served them for millions of years. But the pace of change was beginning to outstrip the pace of adjustment. None of this would have been visible to a single bird. Life continued normally from day to day. Hunting succeeded, rest followed, seasons passed. But across deep time, the balance was shifting, quietly, steadily. In the next part, the story will follow terror birds into their later history. As continents changed configuration, mammals expanded into open ground, and the conditions that once guaranteed dominance slowly eroded, setting the stage for decline without catastrophe. As millions of years passed, the slow reshaping of continents and climates continued to influence every layer of life without urgency or announcement. South America, long isolated, began to move toward a connection with North America, a process that unfolded over vast stretches of time and culminated in the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. This geographic change altered ocean currents, weather patterns, and migration routes, subtly but permanently. Environments that had once favored wide, uninterrupted open ground became increasingly varied. Forests advanced and retreated, grasslands fragmented into corridors. River systems shifted their courses. For terror birds, these changes did not signal immediate danger. Individuals still hunted successfully. Territories still supported life. But the predictability that had once defined their world continued to thin. At the same time, mammalian predators were no longer confined to forests and marginal habitats. Some lineages began adapting to open environments. Bodies grew larger, legs lengthened, endurance improved, social hunting strategies emerged in certain groups. These mammals did not challenge terror birds directly. Instead, they competed indirectly by altering prey behavior and availability. Prey animals faced pressure from multiple directions now. Vertical strikes from above and endurance-based pursuit from behind. This layered predation favored faster reproduction, shorter lifespans, and more flexible behavior in prey species. For terror birds, which depended on selectivity and efficiency rather than frequency, this meant fewer ideal hunting opportunities. The success remained possible, but effort increased. Aging individuals felt this first. Where once experience compensated for physical decline, now experience alone could not restore lost opportunity. Older birds hunted less often. Younger birds required longer periods to reach independence. Reproduction slowed slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter over generations. Populations became increasingly localized. Terror birds persisted strongest in regions where open terrain remained dominant: plains, savannas, semi-arid landscapes. Elsewhere, they faded gradually, replaced by mammalian predators better suited to complexity and rapid adaptation. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic extinction event, only retreat and contraction. Thinning, fossil records reflect this change quietly. Terror bird remains become less frequent. More geographically restricted species diversity declines. Larger forms disappear first. followed by smaller, more adaptable lineages. Even these eventually face limits. The evolutionary path that once favored birds on land now favored mammals with teeth, flexible spines, and faster reproductive cycles. Terror birds continue to live fully within their remaining habitats. They hunted, rested, reproduced when conditions allowed, unaware that their lineage was narrowing toward an ending defined not by failure, but by mismatch. The world they were built for was becoming rare, and rarity does not support dominance indefinitely. In the next part, the story will follow terror birds through their final chapters, examining the last known species, their environments, and how extinction unfolded not as an event, but as a gradual silence spreading across once familiar ground. The final chapter of the terror birds unfolded without spectacle, without collapse, and without awareness by the late Miocene and into the Pliocene. The landscapes that once supported a wide diversity of these birds had narrowed into scattered refuges. Open plains still existed, but they were increasingly interrupted by forests, wetlands, and terrain that favored mammalian predators capable of navigating complexity with flexibility. The remaining terror birds occupied these open spaces carefully, their ranges smaller, their encounters with others of their kind less frequent. Diversity within the group had already diminished. The largest and most specialized species had disappeared first, unable to sustain themselves where open ground no longer stretched uninterrupted to the horizon. What remained were more moderate forms, still formidable, still effective hunters, but living within tighter margins. Mammalian predators now shared much of the same space, not through direct competition, but through pressure. They reproduced faster, adapted behavior more quickly, and could recover from losses in ways terror birds could not. A failed nesting season mattered more, the loss of a single adult mattered longer, over generations. This imbalance compounded quietly. Prey animals adapted to mammals with speed and group vigilance, behaviors that reduced the effectiveness of the terror bird's hunting style. Opportunities became rarer, success required greater precision. Aging individuals struggled first, then younger ones followed. Fossil evidence suggests that by this stage, terror bird populations were already fragmented, isolated from one another by geography and unsuitable habitat. Isolation reduced genetic diversity. Resilience declined, adaptability narrowed further. There was no single moment of extinction, no final confrontation, no catastrophe recorded in stone. Instead, the last terror birds lived their full lives within diminishing worlds. They hatched, grew, hunted, rested, and aged exactly as their ancestors had, unaware that no successors would follow. When the final individuals died, whether from injury, starvation, or age, the ecosystems adjusted without pause, and mammalian predators filled the remaining roles. Prey populations shifted again. Scavengers continued their work. The land did not record the moment. Silence expanded slowly. In the fossil record, this silence appears as absence, layers where terror bird bones no longer appear. Tracks that are never pressed again, An apex predator that ruled for tens of millions of years simply ceased to be present, not because it failed, but because the world no longer matched the shape it had taken. In the next part, the documentary will step back from chronology and move inward, examining the anatomy, physiology, and internal systems of terror birds, revealing how their bodies were optimized for their time, and why those same optimizations ultimately limited their future. To understand why terror birds were so successful for so long, and why that success eventually became a constraint, it is necessary to look inward, beneath feathers and bone, into the structure of the body itself. The anatomy of a terror bird was not a compromise. It was a declaration. Every system was shaped toward life on the ground, toward speed over short distances, toward decisive action rather than prolonged effort. The skeleton was tall and rigid, built to support height without sacrificing balance. Long leg bones acted as levers, transferring muscular force efficiently into forward motion. Joints were reinforced, limiting lateral movement but increasing stability during rapid acceleration and sudden stops. The pelvis was broad and strong, anchoring muscles that powered running rather than flight. Wings, though reduced, retained enough structure to assist in balance, opening slightly during turns or braking, contributing subtly to control. The skull was the most striking feature, thick, dense, and elongated. It housed a beak that functioned less like a tool for tearing and more like a hammer guided by precision. Internal bone struts reinforced the skull, distributing impact forces away from the brain. The neck, often appearing slender in reconstructions, was in fact densely muscled, capable of both rapid flexion and controlled descent. This combination allowed terror birds to strike downward repeatedly without injury, a rare capability among vertebrates. The nervous system supported this precision. Reaction times were tuned for sudden bursts rather than continuous tracking. Visual processing dominated sensory input, with forward-facing eyes providing depth perception essential for accurate strikes. Smell likely played a secondary role, useful for detecting carrion but not central to active hunting. Hearing, while present, was less important than vibration detection through the ground and subtle visual cues. A digestion reflected carnivory without excess. Terror birds did not require constant feeding. Their metabolism favored efficiency, allowing large meals to sustain them for extended periods. This reduced exposure to risk and conserved energy in environments where prey encounters could be unpredictable. Reproduction, however, remained slow. Large eggs, long incubation periods, extended juvenile development. These traits supported stability in unchanged environments but limited recovery when conditions deteriorated. Longevity was likely comparable to large modern birds, perhaps extending across decades. Long lives reinforced the value of experience and territory knowledge, but also meant that generational turnover was slow. Adaptation lagged behind environmental change. This was the paradox at the heart of terror bird biology. The same specializations that made them unmatched predators within open landscapes reduced their flexibility as those landscapes fragmented. They could not easily shrink in size, could not quickly alter reproductive strategies, could not adopt new hunting styles without compromising the systems that defined them. Mammals, by contrast, possessed flexible spines, differentiated teeth, and faster life cycles. They adapted by recombining traits rather than refining a single path. Terror birds refined one path to near perfection. And when that path narrowed, there was nowhere else to go. Still, this limitation does not diminish their success. For tens of millions of years, terror birds existed exactly as their world required them to exist. Their bodies were not flawed. They were precise, and precision, while powerful, is always bound to context. In the next part, the documentary will widen once more, examining how terror birds influenced the ecosystems they dominated, how prey species responded to their presence, and how the absence of terror birds reshaped those same ecosystems long after they were gone. Across the vast stretches of time during which terror birds dominated their environments, their influence extended far beyond the moment of each hunt. They were not merely predators moving through ecosystems. They were structural forces that shaped behavior, population balance, and even landscape use by other species. Wherever terror birds established themselves, prey animals adapted not just to being hunted, but to being observed. Vigilance became constant, herding behavior shifted. Some species favored denser cover. Others opened ground where the approach of a tall predator could be seen early. Burrowing increased among small mammals. Rapid reproduction became a defense against sudden, decisive mortality. These adaptations rippled outward, affecting plant communities as grazing patterns changed. In response to altered prey movement, the scavengers benefited from terror bird kills, often arriving after the predator moved on, feeding entire networks of insects, reptiles, and smaller vertebrates. This redistribution of energy stabilized ecosystems, preventing any single prey species from dominating unchecked. Terror birds functioned as regulators without intention, their presence enough to structure the flow of life around them. When they began to disappear from certain regions, the change was not immediate, but it was detectable. Prey populations expanded unevenly. Some species overgrazed, vegetation patterns shifted, mammalian predators increased their ranges and activity, filling portions of the vacant niche, but altering its expression. Endurance hunting replaced ambush and strike. Carcasses were consumed differently. Scavenging timelines shifted. The absence of terror birds did not collapse ecosystems, but it reconfigured them. Balance was not lost, it was rewritten. This process unfolded slowly, often over hundreds of thousands of years, making cause and effect difficult to trace without deep time perspective. In fossil layers, these changes appear as subtle transitions rather than boundaries. Pollen assemblages shift, the tooth where patterns in prey animals change. Predator diversity increases as specialization replaces dominance. The terror bird's legacy became diffuse, embedded in patterns rather than forms. Their bones vanished from the record, but the consequences of their long presence remained inscribed in ecological memory. Modern ecosystems still reflect echoes of these ancient structures, especially in regions where large avian predators once held sway. Understanding this influence reframes extinction not as disappearance, but as transformation. The terror birds did not leave emptiness behind. They left space that other life reshaped according to new pressures and opportunities. In the next part, the narrative will slow further, turning away from ecosystems and back toward the individual, following a terror bird into the later stages of life, examining aging, decline, and death as natural processes within a lineage that endured for millions of years. As a terror bird entered the later stages of its life, change arrived quietly, without any clear boundary between strength and decline. The body still stood tall, still commanded space, still carried the posture shaped by millions of years of refinement. Yet time began to express itself through subtle accumulation rather than sudden loss. Joints that once absorbed impact effortlessly grew less forgiving after long periods of stillness. The neck, still powerful, required slightly more preparation before delivering a strike. Reaction time slowed by moments too small to notice in isolation, yet meaningful across repeated hunts. The bird adapted instinctively, not by altering its nature, but by adjusting its pacing. It waited longer, selected prey more carefully, relied more heavily on familiarity with terrain than on bursts of speed. Experience became its primary advantage. Decades of movement across the same ground had etched patterns into memory, where prey tended to pause, where footing was reliable, where escape routes narrowed naturally. This knowledge reduced risk even as physical margins narrowed. Feeding became less frequent but no less efficient. Large meals spaced farther apart conserved energy and minimized exposure. Rest periods lengthened. The terror bird stood quietly for hours, body balanced, muscles relaxed but ready, awareness never fully disengaged. There was no awareness of aging as a concept, only the present condition of the body guiding behavior, reproduction during later life, if it occurred at all, was rare. Energy investment shifted away from producing offspring toward sustaining the self. This did not weaken the population directly. Terror birds had always reproduced slowly, but it reduced replacement at a time when external pressures were already increasing. Death, when it arrived, did not announce itself dramatically. There was no final struggle that marked an ending. An older bird might fail to secure prey during an extended dry period. Hunger weakened muscles, balance faltered, injury became more likely, or the bird simply lay down after rest and did not rise again. Scavengers arrived gradually, not as enemies, but as participants in continuation. Flesh fed smaller predators, bones returned minerals to the soil, feathers scattered and disappeared. Nothing was wasted. The land absorbed the presence as it had absorbed countless others. Within the lineage, this loss did not register as tragedy. No individual knew it was irreplaceable. Life continued wherever conditions allowed. Births followed deaths where resources remained sufficient. But over time, deaths began to outnumber births, not in sudden waves, but in quiet imbalance. Fewer nests, fewer juveniles reaching maturity, wider spaces between individuals. The decline was not visible to those living within it. It became visible only much later, through absence in stone and sediment. In the next part, the documentary will widen again, examining how terror birds were discovered by humans through fossils, how their remains reshaped scientific understanding of avian evolution, and how these ancient predators continue to influence how we think about dominance, adaptation, and extinction today. Long after the last terror bird had vanished from its territory, and the land had settled into new patterns of balance, humans began to encounter traces of these ancient birds without understanding what they were seeing. Massive skull fragments emerging from sediment, leg bones taller than a human torso, beaks so large and dense they resembled stone tools rather than biological structures. Early discoveries were isolated and confusing, often misidentified or left uninterpreted, because no living bird offered a clear comparison. Only gradually, as paleontology developed as a discipline, did these remains begin to assemble themselves into coherent forms. Layer by layer, site by site, terror birds emerged not as myths or exaggerations, but as precise outcomes of evolution. Scientists traced their lineage within birds, confirming that these giants were not failed mammals or aberrant reptiles, but true avians, descended from flying ancestors that had surrendered the air for the ground. Skeletal analysis revealed the extent of their specialization, the reduction of flight structures, the reinforcement of running limbs, the extraordinary engineering of the skull and neck. Each fossil added clarity, not drama. Measurements replaced imagination. Context replaced fear. The birds became understandable rather than sensational. Their geographic distribution mapped the history of continental isolation and connection. Their disappearance aligned with environmental change and mammalian expansion, rather than sudden catastrophe. Terror birds reshaped scientific thinking about what birds could be. They challenged the assumption that avian evolution inevitably favored flight. They demonstrated that birds could occupy apex predator roles for tens of millions of years without teeth, without claws designed for killing, without speed alone. They showed that dominance could be achieved through posture, precision, and restraint. These discoveries also refined understanding of extinction. The terror birds did not disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because the world changed faster than their specialization allowed. This insight became a model applied to many other extinct lineages, reframing extinction as a process rather than an event. Museums reconstructed terror birds carefully, correcting early portrayals that showed them as sluggish or monstrous. Modern reconstructions emphasize balance, alertness, and control. Upright posture, eyes forward movement efficient rather than aggressive. These representations do not glorify terror. they restore accuracy. Through this lens, terror birds are no longer symbols of fear, but of adaptation taken to its logical conclusion. They are reminders that success within a stable context can become vulnerability when that context dissolves. Their fossils continue to inform research on biomechanics, ecology, and evolutionary limits. And even now, as new specimens are uncovered, the story refines itself further, not louder, not more dramatic, simply clearer. In the next part, the documentary will move toward a long closing arc, reflecting on the complete life cycle of terror birds from origin to extinction, and allowing the narrative to slow into a sustained, quiet conclusion designed to rest rather than resolve. As the full arc of the terror bird's existence comes into view, from tentative beginnings after the age of dinosaurs to quiet disappearance in a world reshaped by mammals and climate, the story no longer feels like one of rise and fall, but of alignment and release. For millions of years, these birds lived exactly as their environments required them to live. Their bodies matched the land. Their behavior matched the rhythm of prey and season. Their reproduction matched the pace of stability. Nothing in their design was excessive or lacking. They did not rush toward dominance. It emerged naturally as other possibilities faded. And when dominance no longer fit, it did not collapse. It thinned, it retreated, it dissolved. The life cycle of terror birds mirrors the broader patterns of life on Earth. Emergence following opportunity, refinement through repetition, endurance through balance, and eventual quiet replacement when conditions shift beyond recognition. There is no moment in this cycle that demands judgment, no stage that can be labeled failure. Extinction, in this context, is not erasure, it is completion. The terror birds left no descendants, but they left structure. Their presence shaped ecosystems long enough to redirect evolutionary pathways. Prey species adapted to them. Mammals learned to occupy the spaces they once controlled. Landscapes adjusted their balance of pressure and release. Even now, those adjustments echo faintly in the structure of modern ecosystems. The terror birds do not linger as ghosts. They persist as understanding, as evidence that life can take forms that feel improbable until they become inevitable. Their story asks nothing of the present except attention, not alarm, not nostalgia, just awareness that specialization carries both power and boundary. That patience can sustain dominance for vast spans of time. And that change, when it arrives slowly enough, does not feel like an ending from within. As this narrative continues to slow, there is no need to add urgency or emphasis. The life cycle has already completed itself through living. What remains is the space after explanation, the quiet continuity that follows when a story no longer needs to move forward. In the next part, the documentary will settle further into this stillness, allowing the terror birds to recede fully into deep time, where motion becomes memory, and memory becomes part of the background of the Earth itself. When the terror birds finally pass beyond active presence and become part of deep time, the world does not mark the transition. There is no boundary where their era ends and another begins. The land continues to receive light, wind, and rain without distinction. What changes is subtle, almost imperceptible, unfolding across spans of time too broad to feel. The ground where terror birds once stood no longer feels their weight. Yet it does not remember that absence as loss. Vegetation grows according to new pressures. Prey animals move according to new risks. Mammalian predators take routes once avoided. The structure of life rearranges itself quietly, without resistance. This is how extinction settles when viewed from within the earth rather than from memory. The terror birds do not disappear as individuals in any dramatic sense. They simply fail to be replaced. One territory falls silent, then another generations thin, until continuity breaks. The last individuals live complete lives, unaware that they are final. They hunt when prey appears, they rest when energy wanes, they age, slow, and eventually stop. And the land absorbs them exactly as it absorbed all before. Feathers return to soil, bone mineral disperses. Nothing lingers in isolation. From this distance, the terror birds are no longer predators or symbols. They are intervals, spans of biological expression, shaped by conditions that no longer exist. Their forms remain preserved only where chance and geology allow, in sediment layers, in fossilized bone, in the quiet arrangement of evidence waiting to be uncovered. The absence of terror birds does not leave emptiness. It creates openness, room for other forms to explore new strategies. Mammals diversify, birds refine flight rather than abandon it. Ecosystems continue to experiment, and the earth remains indifferent to which forms succeed. This indifference is not cruelty. It is balance. The terror birds belonged fully to their time. And that time passed, not abruptly, not violently, but thoroughly. As this understanding settles, the narrative no longer needs forward motion. Explanation has reached its natural limit. What remains is not conclusion, but continuation, the same continuation that carried terror birds into existence, and then beyond it, steady, unhurried, complete beyond the point where terror birds cease to appear in the fossil record. Their story does not end so much as it diffuses, spreading outward into the background processes that shape all life across deep time. Sediment continues to settle layer by layer, pressing memory into stone without intention. The climates oscillate again, cooling and warming in rhythms that no longer include these birds, yet still echo the patterns that once shaped them. The ground where they walked holds no awareness of what it carried, yet its structure has been altered subtly by countless pressures that accumulated over millions of years. The terror birds have become part of that accumulation, indistinguishable from other forces that shaped soil, vegetation, and movement. Their extinction does not create a gap that demands to be filled. It creates a shift in emphasis, a redirection of evolutionary attention toward forms better suited to the present arrangement of the world. Mammals refine endurance and cooperation. Birds refine flight and specialization in other niches. Reptiles persist quietly where conditions allow. Nothing rushes to replace what is gone. Replacement is not how the Earth works. Instead, life explores what is possible within the constraints of the moment. The terror birds, once towering and unmistakable, now exist only as a pattern recognized in hindsight. A reminder that dominance is always contextual, always temporary, even when it lasts longer than entire geological eras. Their long success does not make their disappearance tragic. It makes it complete. A full expression of adaptation from emergence to resolution. As this part settles, there is no need to return to chronology or detail. Those have already done their work. The remaining space is quieter, broader, less concerned with explanation. It is the space where life stories finish dissolving into process, where individuality fades into continuity, where the Earth carries forward everything it has ever held without effort or memory. And in that carrying, nothing is lost, nothing is preserved. Everything simply becomes part of what comes next, as the long presence of terror birds settles fully into deep time. What remains is not narrative but rhythm, the steady unfolding of the Earth without reference to what has come before. Layers of sediment accumulate, compress, and harden, holding fragments of bone and trace impressions that will one day surface again through chance rather than intention. The landscapes once shaped by tall, silent hunters continue to transform, not in reaction, but in accordance with shifting climates and pressures that operate independently of memory. Rivers alter their paths, plains rise and erode, forests advance and retreat, all without awareness that they are moving beyond an era once defined by avian dominance on land. The terror birds are no longer participants in these processes, yet the outcomes they once influenced persist indirectly, woven into ecological pathways that no longer require their presence. Prey species that adapted to vigilance retain some of those traits. Predator strategies refined during competition continue to echo faintly in mammalian lineages. Nothing returns to a blank state. Change builds upon change. This accumulation is the Earth's only continuity. From this perspective, extinction is not removal but transition. The terror birds have transitioned from active form into distributed matter, energy, and influence. Their bodies no longer move, but their materials circulate. Calcium once held in bone enters soil. A carbon once stored in muscle moves through water. And air, the distinction between bird and landscape, dissolves completely. There is no boundary where one ends and the other begins. This is the final integration, the state reached by all life given enough time. The terror birds do not linger as absence. Absence itself fades. What remains is neutrality, a world that no longer expects them and does not notice their passing. As listening slows here, the story no longer advances. It rests within the same continuity it has been describing. There is nothing left to resolve, because nothing was ever unresolved. The terror birds lived fully within their conditions. When those conditions changed beyond compatibility, life adjusted without pause. And that adjustment continues now, unbroken, indifferent, and complete. When time stretches far enough, even dominance loses definition. The terror birds, once unmistakable in form and function, now exist only as a faint alignment within Earth's long memory, not a story retold by the land, but a condition that once existed and no longer does. The plains that supported them have reshaped themselves repeatedly since their passing, responding to ice, heat, moisture, and erosion with equal indifference. Grasses gave way to forests, forests thinned into scrub, scrub opened again into grassland, each transition guided not by history but by present conditions. The terror birds are not missed by these landscapes. They are not required for continuity. Their role was temporary, as all roles are, no matter how long they endure. This understanding is not loss, but scale from within a single lifetime. Extinction feels absolute from within geological time. It feels like redistribution matter shifts. Energy changes pathways, influence disperses, until it cannot be isolated. The terror birds have reached that state fully. No remaining population persists in isolation. No hidden refuge delays the inevitable. Their lineage has closed cleanly, without collapse or distortion. Fossils remain as quiet confirmations rather than warnings, evidence of how completely birds once occupied the role of terrestrial apex predator, evidence that such dominance did not require claws or teeth or speed alone, but coherence between body and world, coherence that held until the world itself moved on. As this realization settles, the pace of thought naturally slows, explanation becomes unnecessary. The life cycle has already completed itself through existence, emergence. Refinement, endurance, decline, absorption. Nothing more needs to be added, nothing more can be extracted. The terror birds now belong entirely to the same category as countless other lineages that rose and faded before memory could form. They are part of the background conditions that made the present possible. And in that background, there is no hierarchy, no emphasis, only continuity, steady and unbroken. In the next part, the documentary will ease fully into its closing state, allowing silence, space, and slow pacing to replace narrative, and letting the story rest without conclusion, exactly as deep time prefers, as the narrative releases its final hold on detail and sequence. What remains is not an ending but a settling, the kind that follows when movement has completed its purpose and no longer needs to continue. The terror birds, once defined by height, precision, and restraint, now exist only as a quiet alignment within the Earth's long processes, not remembered by the land, not preserved by intention, but carried forward through the same mechanisms that carry everything else. Erosion smooths the ground where they once stood. Sediment closes over impressions left by feet that no longer pass. The air moves without interruption through spaces that once required vigilance. Nothing resists this transition. Nothing notices it. The Earth does not distinguish between what was dominant and what was small. It does not preserve success or erase failure. It simply incorporates outcomes. The terror birds are now fully incorporated, their forms resolved into chemistry, their influence thinned into patterns too subtle to separate. This is not disappearance. It is redistribution, the slow diffusion that follows every life given enough time. In this state, questions no longer apply. There is no inquiry into why or how. Those belong to moments when explanation served understanding. Here, understanding gives way to presence, the same presence that supported terror birds for millions of years without commentary or intention. Listening at this point does not need direction. Thought does not need progression. The story has already completed itself through duration rather than conclusion. If awareness remains, it can rest within the idea that life does not require resolution to be whole. That extinction is not rupture, but transition, that the earth continues not by holding on to forms, but by allowing them to become part of everything else. The terror birds have reached that state completely, and in doing so, they no longer occupy foreground or background, they occupy continuity. The same continuity that carries all things forward until distinction dissolves and only the unbroken present remains at this final distance, where even continuity becomes quiet. The story no longer moves forward because it no longer needs to. The terror birds have passed entirely into the condition shared by all life that has finished its expression. Not erased, not remembered, not highlighted, simply absorbed. The earth carries them now in the same way it carries ancient seas, vanished mountains, and extinct stars whose light once touched its surface. Without effort, without distinction, the ground rests into itself, layered with histories that no longer require separation. The sky opens and closes its light across landscapes that feel complete whether watched or not. Time here does not advance. It spreads, wide enough that beginnings and endings lose relevance. The terror birds once stood within this spread as living forms, moving, hunting, resting, aging. Now they exist within it as resolved matter and energy, indistinguishable from everything else that has ever been. This is the full life cycle not only of a species, but of participation itself. Emergence when conditions allow, persistence while alignment holds, release when alignment ends. Nothing in this process demands urgency or grief. It unfolds exactly as it must. If this documentary has moved slowly, it is because the terror birds lived slowly, not in speed, but in duration, millions of years of quiet dominance, followed by millions more of quiet absence, both equally natural. As listening reaches this point, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to anticipate. The story does not close, it settles, becoming part of the same background it describes. Let sound fade naturally. Let pauses stretch without expectation. The terror birds have finished their passage through time. The earth remains. And in that remaining, everything is complete. After everything that can be said has already settled, there is a stretch of time where narration itself becomes unnecessary. The earth continues without reference, without reflection, without pause. Surfaces warm and cool within narrow ranges, shadows lengthen and withdraw. Wind moves across open ground and leaves nothing behind that asks to be followed. This is not aftermath. It is simply continuation without emphasis. The terror birds no longer occupy any place within attention. They do not need to. Their presence has completed its cycle and dispersed fully into the same processes that sustain all landscapes beyond memory. What once required balance, strength, and precision now requires nothing at all. Minerals circulate, energy shifts. Matter participates quietly in slower movements that do not resolve into form again. If awareness remains here, it does not need to hold the story together. The story is already held by time itself. Pauses can lengthen without direction. Silence can deepen without meaning. Nothing is waiting to happen. Nothing has been left unfinished. This is the state that follows endurance when endurance is no longer required. Not rest after effort, but rest as condition. The world remains sufficient, and the long quiet carries on.